To protect working people. More teachers in our schools. More appointments in our NHS. More homes being built. Fixing the foundations of our economy. Investing in our future. Delivering change. Rebuilding Britain. We on these benches commend those choices, and I commend this statement to the House.
To help us unpick Rachel Reeves' spooky speech, we're joined by Grace Blakeley, economic and political commentator, journalist and author. Welcome back to Pod Save the UK, Grace. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So how are you feeling after Reeves' speech? Spooky? Terrifying? Horrifying?
I mean, I guess it depends where you are. Not particularly spooky for me because I don't have a lot of planned capital gains income or any children in private school, but potentially spooky for some other people.
Major landlord and anti-capitalist author Grace Blakeley joins us now. So let's just get straight into it. There's been so much speculation about tax rises and so much incredible conversations about whether or not landlords constitute working people. It's always a relief to be put out of our misery on the end of this particular thing. So can you spell out what the new taxes are, Grace? Because there's £40 billion of them, which we're already being told is, in cash terms, one of the biggest single tax rises in a single budget.
Yeah, so there are some big tax increases in here. Take it with a pinch of salt, that number, because we just don't know how much each of these tax increases will raise. What economists say is that there are always behavioural effects, which means that when a tax goes up somewhere, people, move income around and try and, pay less tax on it. So that's what we're potentially going to see with the capital gains tax increase. So capital gains is a tax that you pay on the increase in a value of an asset over the course of the time that you own it. So, for example, if you have a second home, you have to pay capital gains tax on the increased value of the home after you sell it, and that's going to go up. But we've known about this for a while. So what we've seen is a lot of people selling their second homes, poor people, ahead of this budget, so as to not get caught up in this increase. So that's a relatively big thing. Mm-hmm. We've also got, one of the biggest things here is an increase in employer national insurance contributions. So that's allegedly going to raise 25 billion. So that's kind of a big tax on businesses and kind of all businesses across the spectrum, really, rather than a more focused one on big businesses. There's also a fun little increase in the fuel duty on private jets, which I thought was quite good. They're going ahead with abolishing the non-dom tax regime, which again was announced by the Conservatives before the election. So that's kind of pretty much expected. And we're seeing some windfall taxes increase as well, which is also potentially quite good. Then there's the VAT on private school fees and some other changes to private school taxation. The big shock for a lot of people is that everyone expected her to keep the freezes on the income tax and national insurance thresholds, which basically means the kind of levels at which the tax rates are introduced and start to change. And that's a pretty easy way to raise revenue, because as people's incomes increase, more people get dragged into paying taxes or paying higher taxes. But she's saying that those freezes are going to stop after 2028, which means people will not be as likely to be dragged into upper tax bands. So it's kind of like a mixed picture here. You've got some good stuff in terms of taxing wealth, taxing capital gains. There's also some business taxes, which are maybe going to affect small businesses, but still some focused taxes on big businesses as well. Not everything that I think we would have wanted to see when it comes to, for example, wealth taxation on big businesses and fossil fuel companies in the finance sector, but certainly a step in the right direction.
Just paint a picture for me. When you're saying not everything we could have wanted, what could we have wanted?
Well, a lot of people ahead of this budget have been campaigning for a wealth tax, like a proper wealth tax. We've got a bunch of different, not really joined up taxes on different forms of wealth, of income from wealth and wealth itself. So capital gains tax is kind of like a wealth tax because it's a tax on the value of the increase in the value of certain assets. But it's not really very expansive, and it's not a full tax on actual asset values. And the argument that people have been making, and this is lots of NGOs, lots of campaigners, is that we need a tax on wealth to fund decarbonisation. This budget has given us not a wealth tax, And it's also basically diverted all of the conversation about decarbonisation to this weird technology called carbon capture and storage, which is basically pretty much untested, and definitely isn't what environmental campaigners were looking for. So in that sense, it's not much.
Right.
So we never have to hear this fucking phrase again. Can we just clarify that Labour has managed to keep its pre-election manifesto promise that working people would not be hit by these changes? Is this a budget that's geared towards raising tax from people who can afford to pay it?
I think that's fair mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that is largely fair because the pledge was income tax and national insurance, which is the two main taxes they raised by far the most revenue, weren't going to change. And that has been kept. And actually in removing that freeze on the thresholds, she's giving people even a little bit more wiggle room moving into the future. What I would say is that the biggest thing people are going to notice in terms of their living standards actually has less to do with these tax changes and much more to do with public services. And there are some gaps there that I'm sure we can talk about.
Well, let's talk about them now. What are the gaps?
Basically, what we need to think about here is for a long time, we've been having this debate about what constitutes investment and what constitutes current spending. Now, lots of economists are basically saying the UK has been, had this nonsensical approach to investment and to spending. It's been cutting off its nose to spite its face by including lots of different forms of investment in what we count as current spending. Now, there's an argument that current spending needs to be covered by current tax revenues. That's not really necessarily true, but it's something that, some people maintain. And it's certainly what Rachel Reeves and the Labour Party have been maintaining with their fiscal credibility rule. But investment doesn't in any way need to be covered by current spending. As long as it's good investment, it will generate greater tax revenues over the long run. So, you think about building a railway that, brings two cities together, increases trade, creates job opportunities. It raises, tax from business rates. It raises economic growth, etc. And Rachel Reeves has been talking a lot about the need to unlock growth. She doesn't really want to increase taxes too much. She doesn't really want to increase public spending too much, even though that's what we need. She's saying instead, let's kind of put all those issues off and just focus on increasing growth. The way she wants to increase growth is by raising investment. So we've got 100 billion, I think she announced, in capital investment, which is going to be distributed across a whole different swathe of projects across the public sector. We've got some transport investment, some investment in house building, alongside this national wealth fund that's going to be happening at the same time. So the pledges that we have around public services are mostly to do with capital investment. So think things like, building new hospitals, building new schools, kind of correcting for all of the kind of failures that we've seen in terms of capital spending recently. What is less clear is how all the big challenges around current spending, so like staffing costs, wages, like all these big gaps that we know exist in the NHS, in schools, how that's going to be dealt with. I think it's really important to remember that, okay, this isn't a continuation of austerity. Like, there's no way you can really make that argument.
She said that about 50 times. Like, if it felt, certainly rhetorically, that is the one thing that Rachel Reeves was trying to get across all through the budget.
Yeah, and like, if that wasn't true, I would 100% say it, right? I don't think you can argue that this is a continuation of austerity, but it's definitely not enough to reverse the damage of, like, a really long period of austerity that we've had under successive governments. And that's going to be her big problem, because all these tax changes, fine, if it actually works and people actually pay them, maybe they'll reduce inequality a bit. But the thing people are going to notice is my wage going up? What's happening with regards to employment and inflation, and what's happening with regards to public services? The public services picture looks quite mixed. We don't know whether or not all this capital spending is going to solve the fundamental problems with things like the NHS. And then there were those growth forecasts, which we got from the OBR, which also didn't look amazing.
But Rachel Reeves is changing the OBR borrowing rules to change the way the debt is calculated. And hopefully that would allow for more room for investment in public services. How radical is that as a move? And does that free up?
So this again comes back to that thing I was talking about a second ago, which is this debate that's been going on about current spending versus investment. people have to be really clear in their heads about this divide and what it means. It's the difference between like building a new hospital, which counts as investment because you're creating a kind of physical asset that you can write, this is worth X amount, and put that in a book somewhere, and that adds to the government's wealth, versus hiring a load of new nurses, which is seen as just current spending, and it makes it a bit easier to finance investment. And that is clearly what we're seeing coming out now, is Reeves making this big push for investment across the board. But it does bring out this other issue, which is like what really counts as investment. Because if like building a bridge or a school or a hospital counts as investment, then why does paying the people who are going to work in those schools and hospitals not count as investment? Because ultimately you can build as many hospitals as you like, but unless there is a motivated workforce that is staffing those buildings, then they're just buildings.
So in terms of the changes, when I was listening to you speak there and you talked about the government's assets, my first thought was, I thought we didn't have many left. We sold them all off, didn't we? Do you think that these changes to the rules could actually expedite the renationalisation projects, maybe taking water companies into public ownership, so on and so forth?
It would be nice, wouldn't it, if that was what this was going to be used for. So, when you like sell off a bunch of stuff to private investors and then say, we're going to buy it back, it's basically just like you've given a ton of money to people who had bought this off you and then sold it back to you. And again, this I think is an important point when we're talking about this kind of investment driven project that Reeves has. A lot of this investment is going to be done via the private sector. Now, we know historically that when investment like building schools and hospitals is done by the private sector, it costs more, it often takes longer, and sometimes they build schools that literally collapse or, have other big problems associated with them. So a lot of that investment money is going to be skimmed off the top and go to private corporations that are doing this investment on their behalf. That's certainly true when it comes to housing, for example. So Labour's going to be doing a lot of investment in housing, but it's relying on private developers, which not only means that a lot of that money gets skimmed off the top, it also means that those developers have the incentive to kind of drip feed that housing onto the market very slowly so that it doesn't affect prices. So that's, again, a limiting factor here. I don't want to be like overly negative about this budget because it is a change, but I also don't want to be sat here saying this is transformational. It's going to reverse austerity and change people's lives, because that's not true either. It puts in place maybe the foundations for some sustainable, like long-term growth if we see like more growth globally, which is a big question. And if it's accompanied by much more serious thinking about what they're going to do on climate.
And obviously much has been made about the changes to national insurance and employer contributions. Would it be fair to say that this is a budget for smaller business rather than big business, or is that too far?
I wouldn't say that, because there's a business rate discount that's coming to an end. So lots of businesses are going to see their business rates go up. There's also obviously the employer national insurance contributions, which is like a big bill for a lot of medium-sized businesses as well. But we didn't hear much about, corporation tax, and particularly when we're talking about corporation taxes that affect mainly kind of bigger, more profitable businesses, measures to actually make these businesses pay their taxes. Because this has been a problem for a really long time of big multinational corporations moving money all around the world, moving money to kind of low tax jurisdictions, or just saying they're located out of low tax jurisdictions and then using that not to pay any tax. Another thing that was interesting was there was a lot of talk from Rachel Reeves about basically making private equity companies pay more tax. They're able to benefit from these big tax breaks on what's called carried interest. And we know that there was a big push from the city and from private equity firms, which are a big presence in the city, to say, don't go for the extreme of kind of, removing these tax loopholes altogether. And that's worked. So they haven't gone for the most extreme version of removing those loopholes altogether.
There's one brief positive we should add to this conversation, which is increase in the minimum wage, which I think is something that has been badly needed in this country. 100%,
yeah. And it's a good thing. It was a higher increase than what was recommended by the Living Wage Foundation, I think. So yeah, that's definitely a good thing for people on low incomes.
And 18 to 20-year-olds not getting reduced rates as well.
Yeah.
So that, again, is going to directly impact young people who are on minimum wage.
So, Grace, give us your final review of Rachel Reeves' first budget. How did she do? How many pumpkins out of 5?
Oh, how many pumpkins out of 5? I would give her 3 pumpkins out of 5.
Okay.
We haven't fully covered what the conversion rate is, because does the pumpkins mean that it was really scary, or is the pumpkins a positive thing?
I would say it's positive.
Okay.
Pumpkins save the UK. We discussed this at the beginning.
I'm thinking that more pumpkins are better than less pumpkins.
Right,
More pumpkins are good.
You know, yeah, exactly.
So 3 out of 5.
3 because it could have been a lot less generous. It could have been a lot more generous.
Yeah.
It could have gone further in terms of tackling inequality and raising taxes on the rich. And it could definitely have gone further in terms of reversing the impact of austerity. It definitely could have gone further on climate.
Yeah.
But I'm giving the 3 out of 5 on the basis of like what we were all expecting from this particular government. And on that basis, you know, I think it's about middle of the range in terms of what we could have expected from them. Hopefully we'll be able to put a bit of pressure on them going forward to do some more things, particularly on, for example, climate and public services. But overall, it's a fine start.
Grace Blakeley, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK and for participating in our pumpkin-based rating system for the budget.
Thanks, guys.
The first time might be the last.